Good morning and good day to everyone. This is Kamesh Namuduri, University of North Texas. Today's series, today's talk is the first in the webinar series on the topic of advanced air mobility that is initiated by IEEE Vehicular Technology Society. And I would like to acknowledge the society for the sponsorship and the opportunity for giving the opportunity given to me to give this presentation. So this is about air corridors. I called it as highways in the airspace that enable advanced air mobility services. This is the first in the series, so I will keep the talk very general, semi-technical rather, giving the big picture at the same time, showcasing the research ideas, research topics that are currently being pursued by researchers around the world. The most interesting aspect of advanced air mobility is it is both the theory, it's a combination of theoretical research as well as development in the and pursuit of what I call practical real world experiments rather by the industry. So it's a combination of both research and development. So this is how you are going to see in near future. Advanced air mobility services mean that we are going to experience vehicles like air taxis and air ambulances flying in and around the cities rather, also covering services in the rural areas and tribal areas. So this is just a visualization of what is going to come in near future. Now you can see vehicles flying at low altitudes, somewhere below, below 400 feet, and also above 400 feet, depending on the types of services. So in general, you can say small vehicles fly below 400 feet, and large vehicles such as air taxis and air ambulances are going to fly above 500 feet. So to think of it, let's ask a very fundamental question. There are platforms today. These are called electric vertical and takeoff and landing vehicles, eVTOLs. They are available today by many companies, including startup companies and large companies like Bell, small companies or new startup companies like Joby Aviation. And then there was also lots of initiatives from companies like Amazon that to deliver what I call packages using drones. So the first question that I would like you to think is, why are we not seeing that today? Why are we not seeing all these services today? Even though technological advances have been there, including availability of platforms, today we are not seeing these services because we don't have what I call regulations, best practices, standards. So these are missing. So until we clearly define rules and regulations of the airspace, it is difficult to what I call employ or deploy all these vehicles at large scale. So we have a long way to go, and don't be fooled by people telling you that, oh, all this is done and we are ready to go and deliver services. So that's not the case. So this talk is about particularly what needs to be done at a higher level, but very specifically, how do you manage this airspace? How do you manage the airspace so that you can deploy these vehicles at large scale? So to begin with, let's look at the very important key challenges that still remain obstacles for implementing advanced air mobility services. Number one is autonomy. So I'll spend about I'll say a few words. So here, autonomy requires us to replace or create autonomy services that are equivalent to a human pilot. So basically, we are taking out the human pilot from the aircraft, and we are trying to do everything autonomously. I'll give a couple of examples to make you think about what does it mean. Just a simple example is, suppose say a bird hits a propeller, or it gets stuck on the wing or propellers, or some some part of the vehicle is damaged. So how do you know? How do we find out? If you are driving a car, suppose you have a flat tire, then immediately you can recognize, okay, there is something wrong with your vehicle, and you get out of the road and then try to take care of it. But there is no human being there is no pilot, there is no human being. I mean, pilot is not there. So there may be human being. For example, if you are using air taxi, then you may be the only person sitting in the aircraft, but there is no pilot. So how do you know? How do you detect the failures of different components, and then immediately take necessary action? That's number one. Number two is, think about as a passenger, you are flying, maybe alone or with somebody else. Then you have some chest pains. Then how do you manage this? How do you manage the situation and then say, is it time to maybe bring down the vehicle or land the vehicle, or you can still continue? So these are the questions that we need to answer as far as autonomy is concerned. Then traffic management at scale. We might be thinking, oh, there are already manned aircraft flying, everything is fine. We have a 99.9% safety. Then what's wrong with flying drones? Number one, even though you're seeing thousands of vehicles, thousands of what you call crewed vehicles or manned vehicles in airspace, when it comes to drones, the scale is going to be enormous. It's going to be huge. So think about like buses and trains that you're seeing on the roads, on the ground. Similarly, you're going to see lots of vehicles. So the number of vehicles in cities like major cities like New York or Dallas-Fort Worth, they're going to be huge. So traffic management at scale still is a big challenge. The third is communication support. We need communication for all the flights, all the time. You can't even expect for a few seconds, if you lose communication, then the significant impact is very enormous. It's a question of human lives. It's not the case with the manned aircraft. If you lose communication for a minute, yeah, the flight already has a predefined path, and it's a large vehicle, and then it can manage to fly. And obviously, remember, there is a human being in there. There's a pilot, human pilot. So that's not a real big challenge. Whereas when it comes to drones, even few seconds of loss of communication could create a havoc. Then the fourth important challenge is air-to-air conflict management. So what does this mean? In the case of manned aircraft, there are not too many. Of course, there are many vehicles, many commercial aircraft, but they're not compared to drones that we are going to see in future. That's not a big number. So in the case of manned aircraft, typically the pilot communicates with the ground. So basically, you are getting instructions and suggestions, or suggestions from the ground. There is a air traffic control. Whereas in the case of drones, we are going to experience what you call close encounters. The vehicles are going to come so close, and you have to avoid or negotiate conflicts. So that requires what you call direct communication between the vehicles without ground support. So think of this way: there is no time for the vehicles to communicate through the ground or through ground control station. So at this point, the industry is working towards what you call vehicle-to-vehicle communications, and standards are being developed, but we are not yet there. And the fifth topic is security and privacy. So once again, you might think, oh, there's security solutions have already been there on the terrestrial communications, so why can't we just port them? Again, don't be fooled by those suggestions. The key thing is security has to be lightweight, it has to be very effective, and especially the solutions have to be hack-proof, real-time, and they also supposed to what you call assure privacy and authenticity and all that. So given that, there is a need for developing new solutions, new lightweight and real-time solutions to handle security issues. And the most important topics are then community acceptance. How do you make sure that community is going to allow us to fly the drones. So it requires lots of outreach activities, education, training, awareness programs, and all that. And I didn't even include what you call workforce, but workforce also is a big issue. How do we prepare? Do we have the what you call training courses, certifications, or degrees to support the future workforce? Not really. So it's a long way to. There's a lot of universities are working towards it. A lot of organizations are working towards. And finally, the main thing that is lacking today is the number of regulations and standards and best practices that are required. So these are the key challenges. There is room for research in every dimension that I've described here. So in this presentation, I'll give an outline of this, some of these topics, but more specifically, I would like to focus on three things. One is basically it's about airspace management. The key thing is we want to study what we call air corridors. So what are air corridors? These are structured airspaces reserved to some extent. It's not really completely reserved. I'll tell you why in a minute. So these air corridors are reserved airspaces for advanced air mobility services. There is a debate in terms of, do we need air corridors? Why can't we just fly? There are pros and cons. So in general, I would say air corridors are helpful in urban settings, whereas you don't need really air corridors in rural settings. But the key thing is, given that communication is very important, communication support is required, it is better to have structured airspaces, at least in urban settings like crowded places. There is an alternative. There's another alternative is something called geofence. So geofence is like a virtual three-dimensional boundary that is like a bubble around the aircraft. So basically, we're saying that by creating a geofence around each vehicle, we are saying that no other vehicle can enter this bubble, this geofence. So this is one model, but air corridors are more like subways. Think of like highways and subways. And then the other concept that is related to airspace management, that is a complement or required for supporting air corridors, is what you call UAS to UAS communication or drone to drone communication. So think of this way. Think of drone to drone communication as an alternative to traffic coordination. See, on the ground, we have traffic lights. So in the airspace, we don't have traffic lights. So what do? The alternative is what you call drone to drone communication. And by the way, I use the word drone, UAV. UAV stands for unmanned aerial vehicle. And to be more precise, it's supposed to be uncrewed aerial vehicle. Same way with UAS. UAS here means unmanned aircraft system or uncrewed aircraft system. So what's the difference between UAV and UAS? UAS is a system, as the name implies. It includes the vehicle, all the hardware, software, sensors, for example, communication infrastructure, and the remote operator. So including the ground control station. That's why we call that an unmanned aircraft system, as opposed to just the vehicle. So here are some visual illustrations. This is more of a theoretical concept. It is being evolved. Very few people there is research that has started just in the last few years. I will give you the literature survey on this in a few minutes. But generally, when we talk about air corridor, think of a highway system, whereas a single lane, we can call that as an air track or a sky lane. So you can imagine, at least for research purposes, the lanes are going to be something like this, what you see on the screen. So vehicles will be flying in those lanes. These lanes are expected to be like one-way lane. One vehicle, vehicles going one after the other, just like the way you see on the road. So this for research purposes, but practically you can't have such a nice sky lane in the airspace. The reason is, even though you think when we lift our heads and then look into the sky, look into the airspace, you see that you might feel that there's a lot of empty space, but that's not the case. Airspace is very crowded. And the reason I said you cannot reserve what do you call these air tracks for advanced air mobility services, because no matter where you go, you are going to see other flights. So we have to share the space. So airspace is a shared resource between among the helicopters, manned vehicles, and unmanned vehicles. For example, let's say even though you try to come up with this dedicated spaces that are very distinct and different from manned aviation airspace. It's called national airspace. Then at least at the time you land or take off, you're going to see other vehicles. So basically, we have to coexist. These unmanned air mobility services have to coexist with other services that we see. So once you start drawing once you go to the drawing board, you can come up with great design concepts. In fact, that is exactly where we are in the research community. We're trying to figure out what is the structure of these air corridors. How do we define what you call a single cell? And there are many avenues for continuing research, especially for students. So just we can go to the design board, design table, and then think about how can we design these highway structures in the airspace. But obviously, it's not just something that you can do at your table. This is not completely theoretical. It has to work in reality. So we need to work with federal aviation agencies in each country, and also local departments, federal aviation, and other government regulations, regulatory bodies like FCC, to figure out to design this kind of structures. So here is another picture. Think of like you have a standard westbound and eastbound, southbound, and there are fast lanes. You can include fast lanes, provided you have space. But that's not the case. You don't have so much space. Then sometimes there may be some emergency scenario, so we need to think about additional lanes as needed. So who will think about this? Who will give this? Who will give permissions or access? So obviously, it has to be part of this federal aviation agencies within the respective countries. The second thing is, at least at this point, the idea is that federal agency is not going to operate these drones on a day-to-day basis. So it is the industry. Maybe think about like federated entities that have to work together to come up with this traffic management solutions. So it is not, at least now the plan is not for federal aviations to support this, to support the drone traffic management, etc. So this is still being debated and being thought about. So what about circular intersection? You might have seen this in many cities, and especially in campuses. Circular intersection is also called roundabout. So once again, the advantage of this is a vehicle can come in any direction and then also exit in any direction. That's the advantage of this. So it's kind of saves space to think about it. Okay, it doesn't stop us. The design is like once you start designing, you can think of many things. Another way to look at air corridor is having a multi-layer air corridor. So the way we thought about this is, again, it's not the first time. You will see some similar designs in the literature. So think of like east and west bounds are on the lower level, and on the upper level you have south and north bounds. And whenever a vehicle has to change direction, it go to the middle. And you can imagine or visualize what you call circular intersection in the middle. So, but you need certain space when you think about multi-layer. We need a lot of space. That's a big challenge. So to think of it, probably roundabout is just a single layer solution or single layer design. Whereas if you think about like multi-layer air corridor, that requires a lot more space. So. And this is not easy to come. So here are the typical challenges that we need to address in the air corridors. So here is a simple example where let's assume that vehicles are flying one after the other, and notice that you need some spacing between. How much spacing is required? that that depends on the vehicle type primarily, and then the capabilities of the each of the aircrafts. But in general, yeah, if you assume that all the vehicles are of same size for again academic exercise point of view, so you need to give some space between these vehicles. So let's consider what I call air cell as one unit, single unit. So one way to think is let's keep 2 or 3 air cells gap between the vehicles. So these are like subways. It's a lane dedicated for to some extent, is dedicated for advanced air mobility services. So vehicles are going one after the other. And then suddenly, if suppose we see a hazard, airspace hazard, it could be a flock of birds, and then, or it could be a very thick cloud as depicted in this picture. So if you encounter such a airspace hazard, what do you do? Then one option is, if it's something that can be avoided by flying to by changing the elevation of the aircraft, probably that's one option, provided it is allowable within the allowable limits. So don't think that we can just go up wherever we want to go and then avoid the obstacle. That may not be possible. So we have to maintain, the vehicles are expected to maintain or remain in the space that is dedicated. So one problem is, okay, if one vehicle avoids, then how can we share that information with other vehicles that are following? At the same time, you also have to talk to the ground. So two technologies are necessary. One is vehicle to ground communications and vehicle to vehicle communications. So these are necessary. So at this point, we don't have standards for vehicle to vehicle communications. So IEEE is working towards setting up, developing the standards. We have a working group that has been working, that has started about 2-3 years ago, and we expect the standards to be ready by end of this year. And again, this working group is sponsored by Vehicular Technology Society in conjunction with IEEE Communication Society as well. So this is a huge rather obstacle before we deploy. The reason we need to have vehicle-to-vehicle communications is, here is clearly an example. There is no time for vehicles to, there may not be enough time to communicate with the ground and take suggestions or guidelines or guidance. So these encounters may be so close and they need to be addressed in real time and probably in less than a second. So in such situations, the only solution is vehicle-to-vehicle communications. And unfortunately, we don't have them yet. There are many organizations in addition to IEEE. I think I need to mention RTCA, GAMA. There are other standard bodies like including ASTM. All of them are actually working together to build this standard. So we talked about detect and avoid. Obviously, you need sensors to detect. And then every vehicle may not have all the sensors. So that's the reason we need this kind of solutions like vehicle-to-vehicle communication to share the information. Maybe sometimes you have to sense the objects or obstacles collaboratively. So imagine that there is a rogue aircraft flying randomly, then it's difficult for one vehicle to follow that. So in that case, the vehicles that are currently flying collaboratively work together to identify the obstacle and find solutions to avoid it. Another example is, suppose there is a large bad weather development, sudden weather development. So one solution is to keep what you call weather stations on the drones, on the vehicles, so that you can get the real-time weather. So the weather that you estimate on the ground through satellites and radars on the ground may not be exactly matching with the weather that you see at different heights, different altitudes. So it is important to develop solutions like micro weather solutions, not just on the ground, and the information has to be collected even from the vehicle themselves. The second challenge that we need to address in the airspace is collision avoidance. So if you have structured airspaces, to some extent, the vehicles are going in a rhythmic or systematic manner most of the times. But in case there are no such air corridors, think of like rural areas where you may not be able to design these air corridors throughout this country or in some spaces. The other solution is let the vehicles fly on their own using the geofence concept we just talked about in the beginning. So that means every vehicle has a geofence and it's not allowing any other vehicle to come into the bubble. Then we need to figure out potential areas of conflict, potential areas of collision, and have solutions to negotiate collision avoidance. So this is another topic. I'm going to show you a small simulation here about modeling an intersection. So let's do it. Let's watch it a few times, a couple of times, so that you can see. So imagine that two vehicles are crossing each other at an intersection. Then see how to negotiate the intersection. So this is one intersection. So think about in future where there are going to be lots of vehicles and lots of intersections. How do we manage? So I also want to talk about some literature survey. I was looking into this recently. Air corridor concept is not really new. Even for manned aircraft, between 2004 and 2009, there have been some studies. And obviously, this research hasn't come to the universities yet. Surprisingly, it is primarily done by NASA, NASA and space agencies, FAA and NASA. And obviously, NASA is the brain behind aviation services in the country, in the US at least. So the aviation agencies, aviation research institutions in respective countries, they will be looking at this. So in the academic settings, this research is not going at the speed that I expected. So I think, again, for the students who are trying to pursue research in this area, it's a great opportunity. So between 2004 and 2009, the tube model has been studied. What is a tube? Is more like something similar to a lane, something like a cylindrical structure that has been suggested as a way to improve the efficiency of manned or crewed air traffic management. As you can see, you may be able to recognize some of the people here. Like, for example, Parimal Kopardiker is known as PK. He is a visionary who's leading this advanced air mobility at NASA, along with several other people. And you also see the sources of where they are being presented or studied or published, typically in AIAA. So it's all aviation-related organizations or conferences. So if you look at the last bullet here, so there is one statement that caught my attention. I wanted to bring it up here. The space is discretized into grids. Each grid in this tube model is about 10 nautical miles in width. So here we're talking about space, and then 2 minutes in height. So basically, you're building a space-time diagram to study the airspace structure and management, and how to manage it more effectively. So these are the ideas that one can pursue and one can bring into unmanned or uncrewed aviation as well. Okay, what about recent research? Recently, as recent as 2021-22, some concepts have been proposed, and something that caught my attention is geofence. The concept of geofence has been introduced by Professor Ella Atkins. She is at Virginia Tech now. She was with Michigan before. So this first paper talks a lot about geofence. So in some sense, geofence is one solution and air corridor is another solution. So there are two solutions. As I mentioned before, geofence could be used for where you cannot design air corridors. It's like free flight, like rural areas, for example. Whereas in the case of in urban setting, it makes more it's more meaningful to design air corridors. Another reason for suggesting air corridors is you cannot provide communications throughout the country. So if you have air corridors, then we can focus on providing efficient, reliable communication support for the air corridors. So to think of it, it will reduce the ground infrastructure, especially communication infrastructure. if we have air corridors rather than letting vehicles fly everywhere. Again, these are research issues, debatable issues. Which solution is better? That depends on other factors as well. And then my group at University of North Texas, we presented or published a paper on air corridors concept, design, and simulation, recently and published in Sensors journal in 2021. And then I also seen, I believe this work, the third and fourth paper, especially are from NASA. Third paper talks about metrics for evaluation of corridors. And the fourth topic is very, very recent. It is very significant paper. It's about real world air corridors. I'm going to bring up that. This is led by by Savi Verma and team at NASA. And then they have actually worked with FAA, and then they designed air corridors in Dallas-Fort Worth area. So that brings up the important point that air corridors are not same for every city. It depends on the terrain, depends on the the population, depends on the building, the density of buildings. So all that. But if you want to look at the real corridors, this is the paper you need to look. I'm going to talk about a few minutes about that. So the geofence definition, definition in the context of US, geofencing used to describe a virtual three-dimensional boundary that each aircraft flies within. Also, you can take a counterpart and say, sometimes the boundaries are designed to avoid. So either you can say the vehicle is within the boundary, so it is allowed, or there is another boundary where you cannot fly in, or these are called no-fly zones. So this is an important paper that I recommend strongly. So here are the real corridors I was talking about. See this? See how different it is compared to the nice block structure that I was showing before. So these are real corridors do not have a nice structure, but you're only seeing the two-dimensional structure here, but still notice the altitudes. Those numbers that you see, 1100, 900, those are feet, and these are, by the way, mean sea level. Those heights are altitudes are mean sea level. So what's the difference between mean sea level and actual what you call AGL or above ground level? You need to subtract the altitude of the terrain in that particular region. For example, in DFW area, the terrain is about 600 feet. So we need to subtract, for example, if you see this orange color, 1600 feet altitude, by subtracting 600, you're saying, okay, there is a space that is available for drones, and probably advanced air mobility services can be deployed at 1000 feet above ground level. So once again, look at with a lot of hard work in specific area, NASA was able to come up with this kind of corridors. But it has to be done in conjunction with federal aviation entities like FAA in the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration in the US, to look into. We need to look into what is the existing traffic. What is how many vehicles are flying. So you need to observe the traffic over the period and then come up with this design of these air corridors. The second thing is, no matter where you try to look, you cannot get a airspace that you can use it dedicated separately for unmanned aircraft systems. The traffic will have to coexist. Manned air traffic and crewed air traffic has to coexist with uncrewed air traffic. On the right side, you will see again, this is a bigger picture. DFW, DAL, these are airports, and all those small circles, we are potentially calling them as vertiports. So roughly, this paper written by Savi Verma and the team, that suggested about 32 vertiports. So what is a vertiport? Vertiport is like a rooftop. Think of like a water tank that you see in each city, in each suburban area. So they will be at a certain height. It includes a lot of infrastructure, communication, and also lots of sensors like like weather sensors. Then then traffic management systems and all that. So it's like, think of like a building with a rooftop where vehicles can land. So the idea here is in Dallas Fort Worth, potentially in future, we are going to see about 30, 40 vertiports, so that people can fly one place to another place. For example, UNT has 2 campuses, one in Frisco and one in Denton. So it's possible in future, in few years, we'll be flying from Denton to one campus to another campus, fairly quickly. Or if somebody you want to go to airport, yeah, we can take this air taxi and then go to airport within minutes. The most important, the real application is medical services. Think about an air ambulance. Today, it takes roughly, in urban settings, maybe 15 minutes. In rural areas like Oklahoma, it takes about 45 minutes to 1 hour to go to a hospital. Think about how beneficial air ambulance can be. We can go in few minutes, if not 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes, we can reach the hospital in emergency times. So those are the real applications that community led by NASA is looking up to and looking into. All right. So on October 11th, 2022, the team led by UNT did the very first flight test in an air corridor that was designed by NASA in conjunction with FAA that I was talking about before. So this slide actually depicts the importance of community engagement or of industry, academic, and partnerships, public-private partnerships. So here we identify the UNT and with another company called Unmanned Experts. The real pilot is one of my friends over there in that company. So we worked together with 15 organizations to do our very first test. And by the way, before this live test, several years of hard work went in. UNT signed up for what we call Advanced Air Mobility National Campaign way back in 2019, and we engaged with in the national campaign, going over projects like X3, X4. You may know those terms if you, or you can go into NASA website, go to NASA website and read about it. And then we also have done something called X4 Plus, bridging simulations to real world. And finally, we conducted the real world first flight test in North Texas, in DFW region on October 11th, and it was great success. Everything that we wanted in terms of testing many of these autonomous services I was just mentioning, they were successfully demonstrated. And all these companies, nearly 15 organizations work together. On the left side, I'm showing you different routes. These red circles represent what we call vertiports. We don't have the vertiports here. These are imaginary for now, but in future we expect to see these vertiports. So the one at the bottom is Fort Worth. The 2 circles on top are in Denton area, and the distance is about 30 miles. Then what do you need to be able to design these air corridors? Some key points, some key ideas are described here. First of all, the design requires identifying airspace that is distinct, separate from manned aviation or crude aircraft, for example. So in this case, the distance has to be between the conventional traffic or traditional traffic to unmanned traffic has to be 2,500 feet laterally and 1,000 feet vertically. So given such a restriction, this itself will not give us a lot of space. So you cannot just design air corridors wherever you want. So you have to take into account the class, for example, Class B or Class D airspace. I won't go into the definitions. You can find them on the internet. And then the distance between that you have to maintain. Those are the critical important parameters. And also, corridor volumes are assumed to have a floor of 400 AGL. So AGL stands for above ground level. So these unmanned, these UAM or AAM services are going to be at higher altitude as opposed to small vehicles. Small vehicles can fly under 400 feet or under 400 AGL, But these corridors in Dallas-Fort Worth were designed between 400 to 600. But that's not this is only for DFW. If you go to some other cities, it's possible to have corridors between 500 or 400 to all the way up to 3,000 feet. So it depends on the city, the other factors like density of buildings and where the airports are located and all that. So roughly you can say the way advanced UAM vehicles can fly above 500 feet and approximately, this 500 AGL refers to 1100 MSL. So remember the distance in DFW is about 600 between AGL and MSL. Okay, then other than airspace management or structured airspaces, another key factor is communication support. Without communication, if you don't have good quality communication, then it is difficult to manage these services. So we need reliable communication support for traffic management point of view, tracking vehicles, coordination, and negotiation of right-of-way, for example, and also what you call beyond visual line of sight and beyond radio line of sight communication. So for example, if there is a bad weather and you want to communicate, and if the vehicle is not within the direct range, then you may have to share that information with other vehicles. So ground control station will use a relay node to communicate, potentially reroute or sharing any sudden weather developments, etc. Okay, so in general, I'll keep it very simple. You can think of three solutions. You can provide communication support through satellites or cellular networks from the ground, or you can use our own radios like mesh networking or AdHoc networking. Each one has its challenge. Really speaking, you need multiple solutions. You need to have backup solutions to provide reliable communications. So there are, of course, I didn't bring up here HAPS or high altitude platforms. They're also a solution. But again, each one has its own limitations. You think about satellite. Satellite are about 1,000 kilometers, roughly. If you're looking at LEO satellite, it's not a stationary, geostationary satellites. Their latency and is very high. So for the latency from a LEO satellite is reasonable. So we don't have to. In fact, it meets the requirements. We don't have to worry too much about the latency. But the big problem is Doppler effect. Think about this. If you are going to millimeter wave band, and then also high speed of satellite speeds, then the Doppler effect is significant. It could go to, if you do the calculations, it can be anywhere between 10 kilohertz to 200 kilohertz. That's possible depending on the frequency band you use. Of course, the altitude is fixed, roughly about 600 to 1,000 feet, 1,000 kilometers between ground and LEO satellite. But if you use millimeter wave band, then the Doppler shift is going to be significant. Cellular, you may think obviously the cellular industry is trying to provide support through cellular communications, but you can't expect cellular coverage everywhere. The second thing is probably if you define those air corridors, along the air corridors, it is possible to provide cellular communication or coverage. But still, even at this point, there are some experiments that are being done, but not at a large scale. So we don't see. We still have to go a long way to be able to provide cellular coverage, a reliable cellular coverage for advanced air mobility services. Then think about direct. The other option is direct radios. So radios like Silvus radios could be used. Silvus, and of course there are many solutions. So you could put a radio on each drone, but getting a line of sight is challenging. Sometimes even the aircraft itself could be an obstacle. So where do you put the antennas, and how do you get a line of sight between the two vehicles? Of course, there are solutions. You can use MIMOs. We could use directional antennas. We could also use what I call steerable antennas. These are all solutions currently academicians and researchers are working on this. But this is a big picture of what kind of what communication support is possible, and why do we need this, and how can we provide reliable communication service. Okay, this is a even though I talked about broadly about communication support, UAS to UAS, drone to drone communication is real need. As I mentioned before, IEEE is working towards developing this standard along with other organizations, standards organizations. So here are the use cases that we came up with. So think about each topic itself is very rich. There is a lot of room for students and professionals to do research and try them out and come up with meaningful solutions. Collision avoidance. It's not easy. No, collision avoidance is there's not a single solution. Even though I showed one intersection crossing, there may be other solutions. It's not that the solution that I showed, one vehicle is slowing down. You could also think about velocity-based solution altitude-based solution where one vehicle can go at a different altitude, provided there is room for that maneuver. The second use case is merging and spacing and sequencing of traffic. So think about like in a highway or in a skyline, one vehicle is already going and there may be other vehicles behind it. So a new vehicle that is about to take off, it took off and then it needs to merge. So how do you manage that? So once again, V2V communications or US to US communications is required. Third use case is airborne separation. How do you manage the space between distance between vehicles in a lane? For example, if the first vehicle is slowing down, that information has to pass on to the second vehicle and on. And if the problem is so serious, then probably a new lane has to be opened. Again, some people might think, oh, there are already solutions for vehicle-to-vehicle communications on the ground. Why can't we use them? So again, once again, ground communication is very different. Or any solution, whether it is communications or vehicle-to-vehicle communications or security solution, these are not easily portable. So to give an idea, we used DSRC radio. DSRC is a dedicated short-range communication radio that was built, that specifically designed for our DSRC standard was developed for vehicle-to-vehicle communications on the ground. And we tried to airlift, put it on a drone, and the range was not even 50 feet. So the point is, the solutions that we use for ground cannot be ported. So in terms of maintaining airborne separation, there is a need for using US to US communication solutions. The other use case is airborne rerouting. I was mentioning before, rerouting refers to changing the initial flight plan based on for reasons such as airspace hazards. So when you reroute, it may be for only one or two vehicles, or it could be for all the vehicles. So key thing is who does the rerouting. It could happen by the aircraft itself, or maybe an operator on the ground. And occasionally you may have to change the route for all the vehicles. So V2V communication is also essential for this kind of use case. And finally, sensing and sharing, especially collaborative sensing and sharing of airspace hazards, like lack of communication, maybe sometimes GPS denied areas, or a weather-related problems. It is important for us to detect and share the information across with all of it. All right. So I want to show you finally a small demo that was done on AirPA. Many of you may be knowing AirPA is an advanced platform, research platform for unmanned aviation services like this. And this emulation is available on IEEE Dataport. It was done by John Kessler, he's a student, and Mihai from Institute from University from North Carolina State University, and I was more like an audience and giving some suggestions. So I was included. I was also there. So I'll take a few minutes to show this. And before going to the simulation, also want to thank the for providing this opportunity. Thank the VTS Society, IEEE Vehicle Technology Society, for providing this opportunity. These webinars are recorded and they will be made available on IEEE Knowledge Portal. And then this series is actually a regular series. The next month's meeting will be, next month's talk will be by Professor Rui Zhang from Singapore, and he will be talking about UAV communications for 5G and 6G. In fact, 5G, 6G can help UAV communications, and UAVs can help to enhance 5G, 6G cellular services, and that's on April 3rd. So with that, I will skip this and I'll open a new simulation screen in a second. Hopefully you can see the screen. And this is, by the way, IEEE data port where lots of data and experiments are being collected or are stored. I will show you the YouTube for a few seconds, few minutes, and you can of course.
All right. So I'm just going to quickly run through the demo. You can do a different video. I'm actually just going to do a different take for the.
It is blank for now, so don't worry about it. And it will come up.
But this is what it looks like, and one ground station. So it's launching those images right now. The other thing that we'll want to do is basically change this parameter in CETL so that they don't disarm all. Like basically, once it's ready to take off, and once it actually takes off, there's a zero, so it doesn't disarm from that point. And then I will fire up Q ground control to each one. And then I'll also have to wait a bit just to make sure that get a log. All the KF stuff is happy. But yeah, we see our drones here, and Q ground control. Can head over to Google Earth.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to show, how air corridors can be modeled on AirPop
5 seconds or so. It's going to query to our ground station and get this little mesh. Obviously, it's a very gross looking mesh. That's just because I had to apply a simplification algorithm to it, and it's easier to use a pre-existing one than reinvent the wheel. So it skips a few vertices, but for the sake of visualizing the demo, it's pretty solid.
Yeah, I'll stop here on the demo.
Switch views real quick. Once I go to this one, you can see up in the top right.
We also want to talk about AirPop for a second.
Yeah, we're good.
So we're going to have a separate presentation on AirPop in the near future. But for now, there are some interesting work that is going on here. AirPA stands for Aerial Experimentation and Research Platform for Advanced Wireless. This is at North Carolina State University, and they are actually conducting a workshop on between May 8th and 11th. So if you are interested, visit the website and sign up for it. All right, so with this, I will stop the seminar and then take up any questions that I see on the screen. Okay, so the first question is, how does this corridor interact with low-flying private aircraft? Um, usually, anytime you fly, you're supposed to reach out to ATC. And I believe that sometimes, even helicopters don't have to communicate, depending on where they are flying. So primarily when these air corridors are reserved, it doesn't mean that it is dedicated all the time. As I mentioned in my presentation, to large extent you can think of that these are dedicated areas, but it is emphasized by everyone that these have to be shared. The airspace is a shared resource. So uh, even the people who are uh, flying this unmanned aircraft system, the operators have to be cognizant of any other traffic. So it is the responsibility of both the operator as well as the owner of the whoever is the pilot of the helicopter to figure out if there are any vehicles nearby. Probably, maybe more guidelines might be coming in future, but in general, it is important to note that these are shared resources. Then the next thing is cellular can offer URLLC and 5G with low latency. That is correct. In fact, if you look at the latest releases in 3GPP 17, 18, the requirements are there. What I see is that you cannot find cellular services everywhere, number one. Number two is, latency is sufficient. It's not really a problem, but quality of communication in general, unless we do a lot of testing, we cannot guarantee that whatever specifications we came up with will be enough, will meet our requirements. Again, I'm happy to share discussion in person or in separately offline. The third question is, US to US communications. What is the role of remote ID? It's a very good point. I didn't really get a chance to talk about remote ID. So remote ID is a specification. In fact, it's a first of a kind, or very first ruling that or guideline rather that came from FAA in the US. So remote ID includes the location of the drone. It's a packet. Basically, it's a packet of information that includes the drone ID and its location, its velocity, its heading, all that relevant information. So think of like remote ID as a beacon, but the community agreed that remote ID is not sufficient for negotiating right of way. So V2V is a different effort. There are some commonalities, but V2V has to be, V2V standards have to be developed for addressing right of way and other negotiations. But remote ID is something like a beginner. Then are there countries where drones are being used for package delivery? It seems, this comes up quite often, right? Even in many countries, like in some countries like Zipline, I believe, they are delivering medical supplies and all that. But it is difficult to do the same thing in the US because we have more regulations, and airspace is more regulated in the US. It's good and bad, meaning that it's good because we can be assured of what you call safe airspace. But at the same time, because of regulations, our progress may be hindered. But there are places where many vehicles are being many services are being deployed at large scale. All right. And then the 5G side link should be sufficient for airborne separation. Once again, even though on paper it seems like yes, device to V2V link from 5G, it seems like it's sufficient, but in a recent demonstration that we did on October 11th, neither 4G or the mesh networking, none of them met the requirements. Think about this. Even remote ID is communicated at least several times a second. It's not about data rate. It's getting a good quality link is the challenge. So it appears that it may appear that 5G may be sufficient, but that's not the case. Especially when you look at when we have a transit system. it's difficult to rely on just one solution. Another question is NASA's data reasoning fabric. Wonderful. In fact, I'm working with them. NASA's data reasoning fabric. Data reasoning fabric is more like a matchmaker. It's like a marketplace where the fabric allows us to connect producers and consumers, and it also requires a lot of communication support, especially when you're dealing with real-time issues. All right, I think we will stop here. And thanks for listening, and make sure you sign up for the next presentation. And once you sign up, everyone will get information about all the seminars. These seminars are planned for actually 2 years. For now, we posted up to about a dozen seminars in the series, and these are all given by subject matter experts who have not only done theoretical work, but also did a lot of practical experiments. So I'll stop here and then wrap up the presentation. Thank you for attending.